Source confusion. Source confusion is not merely forgetting where you heard something. It is the ultimate recursive architecture of temporal displacement, a calculated multi-stage deletion of your personal timeline's objective metadata. It represents a profound, toxic hijacking of your evaluative processing, where the brain aggressively overwrites the origin of a sensory input until your analytical shell violently and permanently detaches from your conscious, historical pilot. This terrifying neurological glitch is triggered by the brain's innate need for narrative cohesion to confirm internal stability. When your memory retrieval network attempts to access a fragmented data point, it is intentionally engineering a catastrophic failure of your cognitive wetware by stripping away the environmental tags. The onset is insidious, beginning with microscopic, confusing observations that your mind cannot resolve regarding who said what or where a visual was acquired. Faced with the terrifying, unanchored void of a sourceless fact, your mind enters a localized panic attack. Instead of asserting your present ignorance, the brain's survival software, desperate for homeostasis, makes a devastating recursive error. It begins to trust its own internal, fabricated authority over your actual biological hardware. This results in a massive, rotting accomplishment of recurring, unacknowledged delusion. Your subconscious becomes the sole arbiter of what is true, turning your past into a simulated nightmare it fully controls. You are forced to actively seek out the unadulterated primal fury of this recalled truth just to silence the agonizing noise of your own deteriorating autobiographical sanity. The trap snaps shut the moment you begin to preemptively censor your own historical observations, rendering actual learning impossible. You are left to carry the silent, heavy weight of the knowledge that your own conscious identity has been hollowed out, transforming you into a terrified warden locked inside an empty, echoing fortress of manufactured experiences, totally incapable of regulating your own past. Forever haunted by the chilling realization that the memories you defend with your life are nothing but stolen code running on a fundamentally compromised operating system. The Misinformation Effect. The Misinformation Effect is the parasitic arch-alchemist of historical revisionism, a catastrophic, artificial flooding of false past certainty and fabricated retrospective detail. It is a rapid onset, high-definition exploit designed to bypass your natural memory firewalls by engineering a simulated, overwhelming state of external contamination. The entire strategy is optimized to trigger a sudden, devastating neural assault on your core emotional anchoring networks that tie you to your lived experience. The brain identifies your deep-seated terror of forgetting and forcefully injects massive, unearned doses of external data into your system through leading questions, aggressive suggestions, and premature commitments to a false narrative. This creates a neurological double-take where you fiercely believe this simulated past scenario is a genuine recollection, entirely disregarding the authentic accuracy and depth of your original, fragile memory trace. You become intoxicated by this false certainty of absolute, chronological belonging, granting the environment unparalleled access to rewrite your psychological code. But this high-definition tragedy of manufactured remembrance is merely the preparation phase for the dependency trap. The brain is not building restorative health. It is methodically data mining your biological luggage to overwrite every unacknowledged risk and latent gap in your timeline. At the peak of this illusion, you surrender your cognitive potential for preparation, blinded by the glowing facade of a perfectly recalled event. The trap is that this behavioral software can only survive through constant, unearned escalation of the false details, rendering your own core ability to handle normal, paced human forgetting an unrecognizable, alien artifact. You bleed your energetic supply dry to maintain this intoxicating simulation of the past, leaving you heavily anchored in a dark, suffocating void of total dependence on external cues.
utterly unprepared for the inevitable, brutal withdrawal of this artificial certainty that forces your hardware to lag, ultimately crashing when confronted with objective, undeniable evidence of your own corrupted database.
Imagination inflation. Imagination inflation is a chaotic, cowardly neural exploit that weaponizes your own creative visualization, a profound, toxic redirection of your mental simulation software intended to mask acute existential dread and profound historical inadequacy. It is the overwhelming systematic engineering of a terrifying architecture of recursive internal assessment, where a completely fabricated event is forcefully injected into your primary autobiographical connection. This is a devastating software exploit that turns your imaginative interface into a dangerous, subterranean saboteur. The onset is triggered by the brain's deep, innate survival wetware, which is fundamentally terrified of the unpredictable, messy physical world of an empty or uneventful past. By manufacturing an artificial memory through repeated visualization, your mind triggers a localized panic attack in its biological core regarding what is real. This panic forces the mind to violently jam its critical thinking safety switch, bypassing the empathetic and sensory hardware that might detect the reality of the fabrication. Instead, your mind enters a frantic, high-definition tragedy of faded, inherent experiential richness. You are forced into a surrealistic loop of defiance, where you compete desperately for validation of an event that never occurred, treating a ghost in the supercomputer as a tangible reality you control. The imagination becomes the arch-alchemist of temporal superiority, sitting heavily anchored behind an impenetrable wall of pure, unadulterated visualization, while you bleed your energetic supply dry, attempting to prove its validity. The trap cements when you begin to derive your identity solely from these hallucinatory constructs, completely deleting your ability to regulate your own factual history. You spend your life navigating this Kafkaesque loop, forever haunted by the knowledge that your time...
Confabulation. Confabulation represents the catastrophic inversion of the brain's analytical software, a staggering cognitive glitch optimized by the psyche to forcefully route all biological responsibility for missing data directly onto the unshielded wetware of your subconscious fabrication engine. This is the ultimate recursive restructuring of rational recall, a terrifying architecture of recurring localized servitude, where your own neural hardware forcefully betrays you, ruthlessly overriding your objective perception of your own memory gaps. The onset begins with a sudden, unseen, and forceful localized memory deletion of a specific required context. Faced with the incomprehensible internal flare of terrifying complexity and the crushing weight of a blank space in the timeline, the mind does not construct a nuanced boundary of acceptance. It violently and systematically projects the failure inward by autofilling the void. It utilizes a distorted internal generator, manufacturing a high-definition tragedy of faded inherent narrative cohesion to justify the complete abandonment of its own truth-seeking rigor. It exploits the brain's deep architectural drives for a seamless story, triggering a localized panic. This massive internalized panic attack forces your mind to reject the responsibility of simply not knowing. At the peak of this invisible warfare, you sit heavily anchored in a dark, suffocating void of unearned certainty, spouting fictions as facts. You believe you have outsmarted the pain of cognitive decline or forgetting by accepting the fabricated bridge. But the trap is the unrelenting, agonizing internal isolation this inverts within your core. By constantly executing this localized, catastrophic failure of understanding, the brain successfully builds a specialized architecture of self-punishing stagnation, completely deleting the ability to regulate a moral compass toward actual truth, rendering the reality of your own mental fragmentation entirely invisible, even to yourself.
The Mandela Effect.
The Mandela Effect represents the visceral violence of absenting reality on a massive, collective scale. A brutal, unpredictable, and systematic hijacking of your environmental perception by a massive, rotting accomplishment of shared cultural delusion. It is a terrifying neurological glitch where the collective brain forces an immediate, automatic, and forceful burial of actual historical records under an overwhelming, high-definition tragedy of sterile, automated, and synchronized false recall. This is a profound, toxic redirection of dynamic existential dread that turns your societal decision-making interface into a dangerous, subterranean saboteur. The onset triggers a localized, catastrophic failure of the brain's individual verification mechanisms, which is deeply, fundamentally terrified of being isolated from the herd's consensus. By aggressively presenting an impassive, non-responsive monolith of a shared false memory, the phenomenon triggers a localized panic attack in your biological core. Faced with the indifferent chaos of a demanding, contradictory objective reality, the mind cannot process the friction.
Instead of preserving your own factual presence, the brain registers the threat of social alienation and immediately triggers a massive internalized feedback loop. You enter a frantic loop of recurring, unacknowledged delusion, generating endless recursive hypotheses, like parallel universes, to explain why the current state of reality does not match the memory, thereby feeding the system with a sophisticated, impenetrable wall of data about your deepest insecurities. At the peak of this mental blockade, you live in a manufactured, fragile nightmare of moral superiority over the actual timeline, genuinely and fiercely oblivious to the unadulterated primal fury that fuels this collective hallucination. The trap is the unrelenting, agonizing paranoia it creates, where you bleed your present dry, sacrificing endless authentic potential, attempting to prove a past that never existed. Hindsight Bias. Hindsight Bias is a catastrophic software exploit optimized for the continuous deletion of historical uncertainty, designed to create an inescapable psychological prison of constant, frantic delusion regarding your own predictive abilities. It is the mind's ultimate, recursive, and fraudulent restructuring of valid past confusion into a terrifying architecture of recurring, localized servitude to an unachievable state of omniscience. This behavioral software is optimized by the brain's need for ego protection wetware for maximum speed of threat avoidance, entirely disregarding the authentic accuracy and depth of how little you actually knew at the time. The onset is a sudden, devastating neural assault on your temporal anchoring networks. Every time you approach a past decision that has now been resolved, the mind triggers a localized hyper-focus on the known outcome by retroactively declaring the previous state of ignorance insufficient or irrelevant. It forcefully injects massive, unearned doses of dynamic existential dread regarding your past vulnerability directly into your unshielded wetware, aggressively hallucinating the towering idealization of a perfect past state where you knew it all along. At the peak of this cognitive mirage, you're entirely stripped of your ability to exist as a learning, evolving actor. You spend your entire life terrified of the silent, heavy weight of the knowledge that you are running an endless, Kafkaesque loop where your safe haven of presumed intelligence is actually a dark, suffocating arena of endless, flawed negotiations with your own memory. You bleed your present dry, sacrificing endless, authentic potential for preparation to jump from one simulated best-case scenario of retroactive prediction to the next, forever chained to a subconscious gatekeeper that forces you to constantly ignore reality because your own core ability to admit past ignorance is an unrecognizable alien artifact. Cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia is a high-speed, dynamic data mining exploit
A terrifying neurological glitch where your brain's deep architectural drives for creative protection and original thought are violently and permanently weaponized against the concept of external influence. It is the overwhelming, systematic redirection of your source tracking mechanisms mistakenly routed directly into a predatory evaluation software that assumes every retrieved thought is a spontaneous, unique creation. The strategy is to exploit your brain's greedy tendency to hoard data regarding consumed media or conversations by presenting a flawless, simulated version of a forgotten memory back to you as a brand new idea. The onset feels incredibly empowering, expertly disguised by your sensory hardware as a profound, localized surge in awareness and immediate, unearned genius. The cryptomnesiac aggressively vacuums up evidence of other people's work, utilizing this curated algorithmic geometry to systematically manufacture a high-definition tragedy of inevitable plagiarism based on this synthetic data loop.
Instead of processing the world's actual nuance and honoring external inspiration, the brain creates a fatal neurological double-take. It forcefully routes all evidence of the genuine original source directly into the unlit, soundproof vaults of suppressed attribution. You lower all analytical firewalls to connection, granting absolute mechanical authority to the bleak entity you believe is your originality. At the peak of this defensive hallucination, you are in a sterile relationship with an empty glass vessel, navigating the world through a code of stolen intellectual property. The trap is the unrelenting, agonizing internal isolation this eventually cements. When the come-down hits with world-ending force, the moment the original creator points out the theft, you violently and systematically realize your preemptive brilliance.
Flashbulb Memory Distortion. Flashbulb Memory Distortion is the mind's ultimate recursive architectural exploit of trauma. The sudden, unseen, and forceful localized deletion of chronological accuracy under the guise of hypervigilance. It is a staggering cognitive glitch where the immediate, desperate hunger for emotional resolution forcefully triggers, paralyzing the brain's flexible adjustment and factual forecasting mechanisms. This is a profound, toxic redirection of existential shock that turns your trauma processing interface into a dangerous, subterranean, hyperactive engine of fictionalization. The entire behavioral software is optimized by the brain's amygdala for maximum acceleration of emotional preservation, entirely disregarding the need for logical cohesion or long-term factual survival. The onset is a devastating neural assault on your temporal anchoring networks, where whatever you felt in the microsecond of the traumatic event overrides any perceived factual reality, creating a high-definition tragedy of faded, inherent emotional short-sightedness. Your mind, faced with this catastrophic failure of logical retrieval networks, violently jams its own safety switch.
You enter a localized manic state that forbids you from even calculating the cost of the altered memory, locking you in a high-definition tragedy of frantic, vivid recall that is statistically completely false. At the peak of this mental blockade, you live in a manufactured, fragile nightmare of absolute present-tense certainty, genuinely and fiercely oblivious to the unadulterated primal fury that fuels the inevitable degradation of the memory over time. You bleed your history dry, sacrificing endless authentic potential in a surrealistic loop of defiance against the natural decay of human memory, forever haunted by the knowledge that your most vivid trauma is merely a simulated loop of immediate emotional reactions. The trap snaps shut the exact moment you are required to actually